Hello, we are talking about Chapter 6 percents, focusing on Lesson 4, percent of change. A change in a quantity is often described as a percent increase or a percent decrease. To calculate a percent increase or decrease, use this equation. So this percent of change, and the answer is in a percentage. So whatever you get, you can just put a percentage on the end of it because that's what the answer is the amount of increase or decrease divided by the original amount multiplied by 100. That's how you find the percent of change in the form of a percentage. So let's go ahead and look at the percent of change from 28 to 42. Now, when we're looking at these two numbers, there's the percent change can come in one of two ways. It can be a percent increase or it can be a percent decrease. So how you determine that is you look at your start. This is the original amount right here. Now, is the original amount getting bigger or is the original amount getting smaller? And in this instance, it's getting bigger. So since it's getting bigger, we are going to be talking about a percent increase. So our answer at the end of using this formula is going to represent a percent increase. So first we have to fill out the formula, we have to find the amount of increase or decrease. To do that, we need to find the difference between the two numbers. So 42 minus 28 equals 14. Then we need to look at the original amount, 28. And then we're ready to put it into our formula. So we're going to use the equation here. The amount of increase or decrease, it is a change of 14. That's going to go right here. Over the original amount goes right here. So we got 14 over 28 times 100, and that equals 50%. But let's look at it over here. So 14 over 28 times 100. Okay. So this is a fraction. We can go ahead and simplify this. Do we know something that goes into both of these numbers? I do. I know that 7 goes in. 7 goes into 14 2 times, and it goes into 28 4 times. But we can reduce 2/4 even further. 2 goes into both of these. 2 goes into 2 1 time, and 2 goes into 4 2 times. So really what we're doing is we're taking 1/2 times 100, and 1/2 of 100 is 50%. Okay, remember whatever our answer is, we can just put a percentage on the end of it. And that is our percent increase from 28 to 42. So an increase from 28 to 42 represents a 50% increase. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at problems and see how this works. So number 1 says find each percent of change. So we have 8. And 8 is increased to 22. So we know that we're doing a percentage increase because this original number is getting bigger. The first thing we have to do is find the change between these numbers. So what is 22 minus 8? Well, 22 minus 8, I'm going to have to borrow. I'm making that a 112. Take away 8 is 4, and then we drop down the 1. So the percent of change is 14. The original amount that we started with is 8. So if we look at the formula, we take the amount of change that goes on top, 14 over 8, which is the original amount, and we multiply that by 100. Now to do that, I'm going to first simplify this. What goes into both 14 and 8? Well, I know that 2 goes into those. 2 goes into 14 7 times, and 2 goes into 8 4 times. So really what I'm looking at is 7/4 times 100. So if I want to put that down here and make this 7/4 times 100 and make 100 over 1, I can look to cross cancel. And I know that 100, I can cancel. There's a common factor between 100 and 4. 4 goes into both. 4 goes into 4 1 time, and 4 goes into 100 25 times. So then I can just multiply across. 7 times 25. Well, I'm not sure what that is, so I'm going to take it over to the side. I'm going to go 25 times 7. And 7 times 5 is 35. Write the 5, carry the 3. 7 times 2 is 14. Plus 3 would be 17. So that ends up being 175. And then 1 times 1 is just 1. So at the end of the day, 175 over 1 is the same thing as 175. So that means it's 175. Remember, whatever answer we get, we just put a percentage on the end of it. It's a 175% increase. So 8 gets bigger by quite a bit, 175%. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to problem 2. We have a 90% is decreased to 81. So we start with 90 and it gets smaller. So we know we are dealing with a percentage decrease, and I'm just pointing down to represent decrease. So the first thing we have to do is find the amount of change between 90 and 81. So if we go 90 minus 81, we have to borrow, making that 10 and that 8. 10 take away 1 is 9, 8 take away 8 is 0. So the amount of change is 9. The original amount is 90. So our equation says we take the amount of change 9 over the original amount, which is 90, and then we multiply it by 100. So 9 over 90, I can go ahead and simplify that. I know that they both have a common factor of 9. 9 goes into 9 1 time, and 9 goes into 90 10 times. So what I have is I have 1 over 10 times 100. And I'm going to make this 100 over 1. And so I'm multiplying fractions once more. Whenever I'm multiplying fractions, I look to cross cancel. And I'm looking at 10 and 100. Is there a common factor between those two? And the answer is yes. 10 goes into 10 1 time, and 10 also goes into 100 10 times. So when I multiply across, I go 1 times 10, which is 10, over 1 times 1, which is 1. 10 over 1 is the same thing as 10. So I know that the number's getting smaller. Whatever number I get, I can put a percentage on. And that's my answer. It is a 10% decrease from 90 to 81. So now I want you to go ahead and try 3 and 4. Where is our friend? Oh, here's the pause dragon, reminding you that you need to pause your device. Go ahead and work out problems 3 and 4. When you get done, press play and we will see how you did. See you in a bit. Okay, we're back. Let's go ahead and see how you did on problem 3. So problem 3 states that 125 is increased to 200. So the first thing we have to do is figure out the amount of change between 200 and 125. So I'm just going to go 200 minus 125. I'm going to have to borrow from this, making that a 1, that a 9, and that a 10. 10 take away 5 is 5. 9 take away 2 is 7. 1 take away 1 is 0. So the amount of change is 75. The original amount that we started with was 125. So our equation says we take the amount of change, we put that on top, and divide it by the original amount, which is 125, and then multiply that by 100. So when I'm looking at 75 and 125, I want to ask myself, can I simplify anything here? And the answer is yes. I know that 25 goes into 75, and it also goes into 125. 25 goes into 75 3 times, and 25 goes into 125 5 times. So what I have, I end up with 3/5 times 100, and I'm going to make it 100 over 1. Now I'm still multiplying fractions, so I'm going to look to cross cancel first. I know that 5 and 100 have a common factor of 5. 5 goes into 5 1 time, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. And then I just multiply across. 3 times 20 would be 60. 1 times 1 is 1. 60 divided by 1 would be 60. And that means we just put a percentage on the end because that's the formula. So it's going to be 60%. And is this an increase or a decrease? Well, we started with 125 and it's getting bigger, so this is a 60% increase. So if you got that right, awesome job. let's move on to problem number 4. So problem number 4 states that 400 is decreased to 60. So the first thing we need to do is find the amount of change between 400 and 60. I'm going to do that off to the side here. 40 minus 60. 0 minus 0, 0. That's not big enough, so I need to borrow, making that 10. 10 take away 6 is 4. I drop down the 3, and so I'm left with 340. So that's the amount of change. The original amount is what I started with, and I started with 400. So now I'm ready for my equation. The amount of change goes on top over the original amount, which would be 400, and all of that is multiplied by 100. Now what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and simplify this. I know that 10 goes into both of those. 10 goes into 340 34 times, and 10 goes into 400 40 times. Now I can simplify further. They are both even, so I know that 2 goes into both of these. 2 goes into 34. I'm going to say it goes in 17 times. And 2 goes into 40 20 times. Now at this point, I don't think I can simplify that any further. So I have 17 over 20 multiplied by 100. I'm going to make 100 a fraction, 100 over 1. And I'm going to look to multiply these fractions together. Now, is there a common factor between 20 and 100? Yes, the answer is 20. 20 goes into 20 one time, and 20 goes into 100 5 times. So now I can just multiply across. 17 times 5, I don't know what that is off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to do the multiplication on the side. 5 times 7 is 35. Write the 5, carry the 3. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 3 is 8. So it equals 85 over 1 times 1, which is 1. 85 divided by 1 is just 85%. That's what the answer is, 85%. And then is this an increase or a decrease? Well, let's look at the number that we started with. We started with 400 and the number got smaller. So we know that this is an 85% decrease. So if you got that right, great job. Let's go ahead and look at the back page. So we're just going to go ahead and find each percent change. So I'm going to do the first one. We have 64 is decreased to 48. So the first thing we're going to do is find the amount of difference between these two numbers, 64 and the amount of change. So I'm just going to go 64 minus 48. The 4 is not big enough, so I need to borrow, making that a 5. 14 take away 8 is 6. 5 take away 4 is 1. So the amount of change is 16 over the original amount, which is 64. And we're going to multiply this by 100. But before we multiply it by 100, I want to try to reduce this. Is there a number that goes into both 16 and 64? And I'm going to say, yeah, 8 does. 8 goes into 16 2 times, and 8 goes into 64 8 times, because 8 times 8 is 64. Now, is this reduced 2/8 to the simplest amount? No, it's not. This can be reduced further because 2 goes into both 2 and 8. 2 goes into 2 one time, and 2 goes into 8 4 times. 2 goes into 8 4 times. So what I end up with is 1/4 times 100. Now I'm going to make 100 over 1, and I can look to multiply these fractions together. Whenever I'm multiplying fractions, I want to look to cross-cancel first. Are there any common factors between 4 and 100? The answer is yes. 4 goes into 4 one time, and 4 goes into 100 25 times. And now I can just multiply across. 1 times 25 is 25. 1 times 1 is 1. I have 25 over 1, and whatever I get here, that's 25. I just put a percent on the end. So 25%, and 64 is getting smaller, so we know it's a decrease. A 25% decrease. That's what is represented in this problem. So now it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to go ahead and finish 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So go ahead press pause, work on those problems. When you get done, press play and we'll talk about them. All right, see you in a bit. See you in a bit. All right, we're back with problem 6. Let's go ahead and find the percent increase from 140 to 273. The first thing we have to do is find the amount of change. So I'm going to subtract those two numbers. 273 minus 140. And 3 take away 0 is 3. 7 take away 4 is 3. 2 take away 1 is 1. Okay? So that's the amount of change is 133 over 140. This is the original amount, so that goes on the bottom. The formula says then I multiply it by 100. So I'm going to look at 133 over 140 and see if I can simplify this. Well, I know that this is not divisible by 2 because this is odd and this is even, so that's not going to work. I could see if these are both divisible by 3 by going 1 plus 3 plus 3. 1 plus 3 is 4. 4 plus 3 is 7. 7 is not divisible by 3. So that means these aren't divisible by 3. So I think what I'm going to do, it doesn't seem like I can reduce this at all. I'm just going to go ahead and look to make 100 into a 1 and look to cross cancel first. So when I look at this problem, I'm looking to cross cancel. I notice there's a common factor between 100 and 140. The common factor between 100 and 140 is 10. 10 goes into 100 10 times, and 10 goes into 140 14 times. After that, I'm going to look to cross cancel again. There's a common factor of 2. 2 goes into 10 5 times, and 2 goes into 14 7 times. After that, I can't really cross cancel anything. So I'm just going to multiply across. So 133 times 5, I need to go ahead and figure out what that is. 133 times 5. That ends up being 5 times 3 is 15. Write the 5, carry the 1. 5 times 3 is 15, plus 1 is 16. Write the 6, carry the 1. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 is 6. So we have 665 over 7 times 1, which is 7. So at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and divide that with long division. 665 divided by 7. 665 divided by 7. 7 does not go into 6. Okay, does 7 go into 66? Yes, it does. It goes in 9 times because 9 times 7 is 63. Then I subtract. 6 take away 3 is 3. I drop it like it's hot. Drop that 5 down. 7 goes into 35 5 times. 5 times 7 is 35. And there's no remainder, so I know that I'm done. So I know that this ends up being 95, and that's 95%. So 140 is increased to 273, so I know that that is a 95% increase. So if you got that one right, great job. Let's go ahead and work on problem 7. Let's see how you did on 7. So 7 is decreased by 6. No, problem 7. 30, the number 30 is decreased to 6. Sorry about that. 30 is decreased to 6. So the first thing that we need to differentiate is what is the amount of change between 30 and 6. So I'm just going to go ahead and subtract that. 30 take away 6. I'm going to have to borrow. 10 take away 6 is 4. I drop down the 2. So the amount of change is 24 over the original amount, which is 30, and then we multiply it by 100. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to reduce this right here. Is there a common factor between 24 and 30? Yes, there is. 6 goes into both. 6 goes into 24 4 times, and 6 goes into 30 5 times. So I now know that I'm dealing with 4/5 times 100. I'm going to make this 100 over 1 and then just multiply these fractions together. First, when you're multiplying fractions, you look to cross cancel. There's no common factor here, but is there a common factor here? Yes. 5 goes into both 5 and 100. 5 goes into 5 one time, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. And then I just multiply across. 4 times 20 is the same thing as 4 times 2, which is 8, and then you add a 0, so it's 80, over 1 times 1, which is just 1. So that ends up being 80, and then you put a percent on the end of it. So this is an 80%. And is this number getting smaller, or is it getting bigger? And when we start here, the number gets smaller. So it's an 80% decrease. All right, so if you got that one right, great job. Let's go ahead and move on to problem 8. We have 15, and it is increased to 21. So the first thing we need to determine is the amount of change. What's happening? What is the difference between 21 and 15? When we look at these two numbers, I'm going to have to borrow there. 11 take away 5 is 6, and that's a 1, and that's nothing. So the amount of change is 6 over the original amount, which is 15, and then we multiply that by 100. Okay, first I'm going to reduce this. Is there a common factor between 6 and 15? The answer is yes. 3 goes into both of those. 3 goes into 6 2 times, and 3 goes into 15 5 times. So I end up with 2/5 times 100. I'm going to make 100 a fraction, so 100 over 1. So I'm just multiplying fractions here. So the first thing I'm going to do is look to cross cancel. I can't do anything with the 1 and 2, so I'm going to look at the 5 and 100. And there's a common factor of 5 between them. 5 goes into 5 one time, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. After that, I'm just going to multiply across. 2 times 20, that's pretty nice because there's 0. I can go 2 times 2, which is 4, and then add the 0. So 2 times 20 is 40, over 1 times 1, which is 1. So 40 over 1 is the same thing as 40, which means I'm dealing with a 40%, and this number is getting bigger, so it's a 40% increase. So if you got that problem right, great job. Let's go ahead and work out problem 9. So we start with 7, and 7 is increased to 21. So the first thing we have to do is figure out what is the amount of change. So I'm just going to go 21 minus 7. I need to borrow. That's going to be a 1. 11 take away 7 is 4. I drop the 1 down. So it's 14. 14 over the original amount, which is 7. And then we're going to multiply that by 100. Okay, so when I'm looking at this, I want to see if I can reduce anything. Are there any common factors between 14 and 7? The answer is yes. 7 goes into 14 2 times, and 7 goes into 7 1 time. So I end up having 2 over 1 times 100. And 2 over 1 times 100 is really the same thing as just 2 times 100, which ends up being 200. And so this ends up being 200%. This is a 200%. We start with 7, and 7 gets bigger, so it's a 200% increase. All right, let's go ahead and look at the last one, problem 10. Problem 10 says we start with 320, which is decreased to 304. So the first thing we need to determine is what is the amount of change. So we're going to go 320 minus 304. We need to borrow here, making that a 1 and that a 10. 10 take away 4 is 6. 1 take away 0 is 1, and 3 take away 3 is just 0. So the amount of change is 16 over the original amount, which is 320. And we're going to multiply that by 100. Okay, perfect. So let's look to reduce this first. Okay, I bet you that 4 goes into both of those, but I need to figure that out. How many times does 4 go into 320? 4 does not go into 3, but 4 does go into 32, and it goes in 8 times. 8 times 4 is 32. 32 take away 32 is 0. Then you drop that 0 like it's hot. 4 doesn't go into 0. 0 times 4 is 0. No remainder. Boom. We're done. So that means that 4 goes into 320 80 times. And 4 goes into 16 4 times. So now I have 4 over 80. Now, I'm pretty sure that there is something that goes into both of those. I think 4 does. 4 goes into 4 one time. 4 goes into 80 20 times. So we end up with 1/20 times 100. I'm going to make this 100 over 1. Then we can look to, we're multiplying fractions, so we can look to cross cancel. Is there a common factor between 20 and 100? The answer is yes. 20. 20 goes into 20 one time, and 20 goes into 100 5 times. Then we just multiply across. 1 times 5 equals 5, and 1 times 1 is 1, which ends up being 5. So this is 5%, and the number 320 is getting smaller, so that means it's a 5% decrease. Okay, so if you got all those right, yoke de ikimashita, you did a great job, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.